third season's plot, its twists, ending, and also giving our full review of the series. Full spoilers ahead, so if you haven't had a chance to check it out and don't want to be in the show, will you head off right now? If you wolf the breakdown, then please drop a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for videos like this each and every day. With that out of the way, thank you for clicking this. Now let's get into our You Season 3 breakdown. Now I feel we have to talk about the plot of Season 2 and 3 before we dive into the ending, as there are important points that will definitely have to be considered as being influential to how things wrap up. If you just watch the show and don't want a big recap, then time codes will be linked below, but if you do skip ahead, I'll never forgive you. Yes, you this time. Now Season 2 followed Joe, or rather Will, as he stalked Love, played by Victoria Pedretti. Though she seemed really sweet and innocent, and the kind of person you'd never suspect could be the bent neck lady, there was a darker side to her. Love was as obsessed with Joe as Joe was with her, and she ended up killing Candace and Delilah because they were obstacles in the way for her to get to him. Love wanted a perfect family more than anything, and it seemed like she ended up getting it in the end as the pair settled down in the suburbs. It was very much a fresh start for them, and it also offered her the opportunity to move on from the death of her brother, who won't make it to 40. Pregnant with her own potential psychopath, it seemed like somewhat of a happy ending, but Joe ended up going back to his old ways once he spotted his next you through the fence at his home. Not you. Now that pretty much takes us into Season 3, and though Joe sparks up somewhat of a romance with her neighbor Natalie, it's very short-lived and Love kills her. For the last 2 years I've been theorizing that there'd be a season of stalking in which Love would eventually uncover it all, but by the end of episode 1, Natalie goes down worse and when you watch Season 2 again and Chris Delia comes on screen. Yikes. Now this starts a brutal game of the couple attempting to cover up the crime, hit on everyone they can, and also deal with each other's psychotic personalities. There's always been a dark sense of humour to You, and early on I found it hilarious how Joe was sure he was going to have a daughter and then a son popped out instead. Joe isn't exactly the kind of man you want your kids to be like, and the sensual psychopath wrestles with how he wants to raise his child. He of course came to the suburbs wanting to paint himself out as the perfect person, and the series as a whole very much carries with it the idea that everyone has a shadow self. Much in the same way that Love revealed hers in the second season, we see as almost all of the characters have a darker side to them that they hide from the world. Whether it's Love and Joe being serial killers, Dottie's drinking, Gil being the kind of guy that tells you to do your own research, the mystery surrounding Matthew, or Sherry's proposition to Joe and Love about opening up their marriage, everyone is presenting something to the world whilst hiding the truth of what's really going on. Nowhere is this shown more than in Marienne and her ex, the latter of whom is a public figure who presents a positive image to the world, but really he's a high-functioning drug addict that abuses her. Marianne is played by Tati Gabrielle, who you might recognise from Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and she brings a whole new level to the show. Much like Joe, she came up through the foster system, and the two find common ground not only in their love of books, but also because they want their children to be better people than they are. They also have toxic partners, and it's not too long before Joe is completely obsessed with her. Love has her own love interests too, and she ends up having a will they won't they relationship with her neighbour's teenage son Theo. I feel like this show is very much a comment on how relationships work, and though things are taken to the extreme, there are a lot of metaphors in the series that you can apply to a standard relationship. Much like Joe, we all kind of get swept off our feet when we meet someone new that we like, and eventually we become closer and closer. However, the world can be a tempting place, and the show very much tackles the idea of whether the grass is greener on the other side. It never actually is, and though Joe and Love become somewhat bored with one another, they're very much a team that are indeed soulmates due to their personalities being identical. When you meet someone else, it can feel new and exciting, but eventually those feelings will fade and you'll be back to where you were. Thus, it's better to focus on what you have and make it into something special. I think the show very much hammers home the idea about growing your own grass and make it as green as it can be. I feel like I'm giving marriage advice here, but it's nice that the show tackles these themes and wraps them in a thriller. Now, whilst most couples have skeletons in the closet, these have literal ones, and slowly their masks start to slip and people's true feelings come to the surface. Dottie at one point accuses Love of murdering her last husband James, and this was a fan theory that was floating around when Season 2 was released. We'll talk about whether it ties into the end later on or not, but it's very important to bear in mind. Now, after Sherry's proposition, Love starts to wonder whether they should try polygamy. Whilst it's initially put in place to bring Love and Joe together, it allows the latter to start his plan to be with Marianne. In the series, it's said that his type is pretty much a sheep that's attracted to wolves, and she becomes somewhat the person that he must save and fix, much like Beck and Love. This was of course mirrored in his mother, who stuck with someone abusive, which led to Joe going into the foster system after his violent streak was born. This idea of an abusive husband slash partner is of course reflected in Marianne, who pretty much has her future ruined when her ex Ryan carries out revenge porn. He sends nudes to everyone in her contacts list, and the way that abuse is now carried out has of course evolved with technology. It's now possible to ruin someone when they're not even with you, and Marianne becomes a motherly figure that he must once more save. Throughout his life, there's been things like his mother, the nurse at the foster home, and now her, who will fit this archetype, convincing him that the latter is his true soulmate. Joe's darker side starts to get brought to the forefront once Matthew's operation unearths him losing his temper and punching a wall. Though Gil was framed for the murder of Natalie, Matthew just doesn't buy it, and he becomes somewhat of a stalker too, as he hacks all of the security cameras in the city to spy on the citizens. His son Theo also becomes obsessed with looking over the evidence they've collected, and it leads to a shocking revelation that we'll talk about later on. Now I love this idea of everyone watching everyone, and it of course leads to secrets being exposed. During their polygamous hookup with the Conrads, Love has an outburst that reveals to them she killed Natalie, and we kinda head into the U formula where people are trapped inside a cage that know the secrets. Where things change though is now Love is solely in charge of looking after the pair, and Joe goes after Ryan to end Marianne's misery. It leads to the latter part of the season being much better than the middle, and the walls start to close in when Theo unearths the secret in the basement. No more Stifler's mum's fantasies for this kid, and Love ends up smacking him over the head, which leads to him being left on death's door. He confesses to Joe about his and Love's relationship, and she overhears the story behind Ryan's death and puts two and two together. The season kinda comes to its logical conclusion with somewhat of a Love versus Joe finale that very much decides their futures. Now whilst the couple have pretty much shared their murderous streaks and infidelity, here we see the major difference between the two. Theo told Love that the pair should run away together, and she turned him down, whereas Joe clearly wanted to leave with Marianne. It leads to a last supper between the pair, where Joe reveals that he knows about James, and Love confirms the fan theory that she killed him. Now it turns out that she injected a paralytic drug into him, but the dose was far too high. She of course wanted to control him, and it's revealed that she actually drugged Joe too. Through the season, Love had spent a lot of time in the garden, and she managed to grow this agent for herself, meaning that there'd be no paper trail. Now you might have questions over how she managed to get it into Joe's system, and it's very quick in the scene. Your first thought might be that it's the chicken, but Love also eats it too, so that rules it out. Love says that it's absorbed through the skin, and the only thing that Joe interacts with that Love doesn't is the knife. Now though she does cut the chicken with it, we can see that she's wearing a glove when this happens, so it wouldn't rub off onto her. Joe grabbing the knife very much seals his fate, and she clearly positioned this in front of him during the meal as bait. After Love leaves, Matthew comes across Joe and discovers the location of his son, and Marianne arrives, which is when Love reveals the big facade to her, including the death of Ryan. She tells her to leave while she still can, and inspired by her being a single mother, Love decides to kill Joe, which is when we get a big twist. It turns out that Joe was well aware of Love's plans, and using elements of Carrie's cocktail, he injected it as a counteraction. It's pretty funny, as these are two people who normally can't think more than 5 seconds ahead when it comes to a murder, but here they're playing 4-dimensional chess. Now this once more shows the difference between the characters, as Joe measured out a lethal dose, whereas Love didn't, because she wanted to try and make things work to some extent. Love's final words are that they're perfect for each other, but bad for Henry, and that he will find out exactly what his father is. Realizing that he has to protect his son from himself, Joe very much follows in his mother's and the nurse's footsteps and puts the child on a path where they won't have an abusive influence in their life. Joe cuts his toe off, puts it in a pie, and stages things to look like Love killed him before ending her own life. Matthew and Theo will somewhat corroborate this, and she becomes more famous than Beck, which is, yeah, wow, what a statement. Now Madre Linda returns to somewhat the way it was before. Theo starts to heal, and Matthew goes back to focusing on his son, with the mystery now somewhat solved. Henry ends up growing up without a toxic influence, unlike the baby Toxie, and Sherry and Carrie go on to developing a radical couples therapy technique after escaping the cage. This is because they find one of the keys left inside that Joe and Love put in place in case they ever got trapped there, and it is a nice callback to what's happened in some of the earlier seasons. Now it turns out that Marianne left the city too, and much like Joe, she managed to escape marriage. We catch him going under the name Nick in Paris, which may be a reference to Dr. Nicky, who he of course framed in the first season. Paris is of course the city of love, Marianne is a French name, and it's very much a new beginning. I actually believe that the character will continue on his quest to find Marianne, as we see someone enter the cafe in Paris that looks a lot like her. Whereas every season so far has ended with Joe being besotted over a new woman, here things are different, as he doesn't become obsessed over this new figure and he travels out into Paris on his own. This is very symbolic, as Joe is now back by himself again in a new city after successfully evading his past once more. Whether he catches up to Marianne remains to be seen, but personally I think that he'll end up becoming obsessed with someone new, and then he'll end up crossing paths with her once more. I'd actually love to get somewhat of a time jump at some point and see him come face to face with his son, which would finally make him realize that he needs to take some responsibility. I kind of feel that next time they need to do something different, as the show is sort of going in circles at this point, and I hope it's not too long until Joe's past catches up with him. There's also potential that he has another half brother floating around out there, as his mother is clearly looking after another child. Not sure exactly what's going on in this scene, but something seems to be happening that could hint towards the future, and obviously I'd love to hear your thoughts on it below. Even before the release of this season, Netflix announced that the show had been renewed for season 4, and we'll be back next week at some point to talk about more of my predictions for next time. Now as for my thoughts on the series, I think if I had to rank them from best to worst, the order of release would pretty much be the order that I'd put them in. Season 1 was the type of show that I'd never really seen before, and it was fascinating watching the mind of a murderer as he hunted and stalked his prey. The inner monologue and narration really brought a lot to the series, and it was super tense wondering if Joe would ever get caught. Season 2 was sort of more of the same, but a big twist came when we learned the truth about Love and saw that she wasn't just another Beck. Now season 3 very much deals with the themes of normal normality and how relationships can lose their spark after a while. Hurts to say it, but I feel very much the same about the show, and though there were a lot of good moments in it, overall I just didn't find it as gripping as the ones that had come before. For the most of it, it very much feels like Joe's past will never catch up to him, and they're rarely put into a situation where it seems like the characters have almost no way out. That's what I loved about the first season especially, but here it feels like they pretty much had a 5-star wanted level on GTA, and then they just hid under a bridge for 10 minutes until things went away. I would have loved to have seen the pair planning murders out and stalking their own people, and though there is some of that here, it doesn't fully come across in a way that I think would have been really good. I actually almost feel like Love is getting stalked by Theo, as he's pretty much the only customer she ever has, and he sticks around until she lets him in, like Venom when he joined the MCU. Also, now that we're getting less narration from Joe, it's occurred to me that I don't really know why people like him all that much. If you completely remove the character's thoughts from the show, he just stands around not really saying anything to anyone, yet everyone is falling over, trying to be friends with him or to get him in bed. Probably a big nitpick, but yeah, just something I noticed, and the guy doesn't really have that much of a personality. Now, saying all that, the main issue that I have with the series does lie in the middle part. I think come the end of the season that everything is pretty much rectified, as it's arguably the highest point in the show so far. Those last 3 episodes are a killer, and though it pretty much sets things back to the status quo, I think that it really hits its stride and becomes an easy binge. Penn Badgley has absolutely taken on the role and pretty much made it part of his personality. He's completely nailing this charming but sadistic stalker, and though he's doing a lot of bad things, you can sympathise with him at points, which shows just how good of an actor that he really is. Victoria Pedretti also does a really good job with what she's got, and she's slowly becoming one of Netflix's best actors after this and The Haunting of Hill House. Overall, I still think the series is worth watching. It just takes a while to get going, and there is a lot of filler in the middle. I will of course be back to see what happens next time, and though it is somewhat of us being back to square one, I did enjoy the outcome of this season. In the end, You Season 3 is a really fun ride, and I get an 8.5 out of 10. Now obviously, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the show, if you disagree with me, or if you agree, and you better agree, otherwise I'll kill, I can't really say that.